All right, buckle up, everyone, because today we're diving deep into the world of Roman Ingarden.
Roman Ingarden.
Now, you might not recognize that name right off the bat, but trust me, this philosopher has had a huge key impact on how we think about, well, a lot of things.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking about how we experience art, how we understand literature, even the very nature of reality itself, all thanks to Ingarden.
That's right. And what makes him even more interesting is he was a student of, that famous philosopher Edmund Husserl.
Right, right. But Ingarden wasn't afraid to, sort of branch out on his own, especially when it came to this big philosophical debate about realism versus idealism.
Ah, yes. The age-old battle of is the world just what I think it is, or is there, something solid out there, regardless of me? That's something I bet we've all pondered at some point, right? Like just staring up at the clouds or getting lost in a book.
Oh, for sure. It's a question that's been haunting philosophers for, well, for centuries.
So give us the rundown, like the crash course. What's this whole realism versus idealism thing all about?
Okay, so you've got the realists on one side saying, look, this table right here, this tree outside, these things exist whether I'm here to see them or not.
Makes sense.
Right. But then you've got the idealists over here saying, hold on a second. How do you really know anything exists outside your own mind? Maybe it's all just, a projection of your own thoughts.
Whoa, okay, so it's like, is the world real, or is it just all in our heads?
Exactly.
So where did Ingarden, land on all of this? Was he team realism or team idealism?
Well, he definitely leaned more towards realism. Like he believed there was a world out there, independent of our minds.
Okay, so a realist at heart.
But here's where it gets, well, a bit more complex. Ingarden wasn't content with just picking a side, he wanted to go deeper. He wanted to understand the very structure of how things exist.
So not just saying real or not real
Mm-hmm.
from the sidelines, but actually figuring out what being real even means.
Yeah, exactly. He wasn't happy with just a simple either-or. Instead, he came up with this really intricate system, what we call a multi-layered ontology, to categorize how different things exist.
A multi-layered ontology. Okay, break that down for us.
Okay, imagine it like baking a cake, right? You've got the ingredients, the raw materials, but that's what he called material ontology. But then there's how those ingredients are put together, the recipe, the structure, and that's his formal ontology.
I'm with you so far. Ingredients and the recipe. But a cake isn't just ingredients and a recipe, is it? There's something more there when it all comes together.
You're getting it. And that's where Ingarden's real genius shines through. He adds a third layer, this thing he calls existential ontology. And this is where things get really mind-blowing because he says there are not one, not two, but four distinct ways that something can be.
4 ways to be. All right, now you've got me hooked. This sounds like we're about to unlock some secret levels of reality here. Hit me with it. What are these 4 ways to be, according to Ingarden?
Okay, so let's start with the really big one, the absolute mode of being. Think of something totally self-sufficient, existing all on its own, needing nothing else. Some folks might use the idea of God as an example, something that just is.
Okay, so that's like ultimate self-contained existence. What about the other modes?
Next up is the ideal mode of being. This is the world of perfect, unchanging concepts. Like, think about mathematical truths.
Like 2 plus 2 always equals 4, no matter what.
Exactly. They exist outside of time and space. They're eternally true.
So unlike our world, which, is always changing, these ideal things are like fixed points in the universe of concepts.
Right on.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's the real mode of being. This is the world we interact with every day, right? Trees, mountains, this microphone we're talking into.
Right, the stuff we bump into, literally.
Yeah. For realists, this world exists whether we're thinking about it or not.
All right, so that's 3 ways to be down, 1 to go.
Yeah.
What's the last one in Ingarden's universe?
And this is where Ingarden really throws us a curveball. He introduces the purely intentional mode of being, and this is the realm of things that only exist because we think about them.
Wait, so you're telling me, like, the characters in a novel, those only exist because the author wrote them down?
You got it. Things like fictional characters, objects, and dreams, those all fall under this purely intentional category. They depend on consciousness to exist.
So Sherlock Holmes, that brilliant detective, he's only real because Sir Arthur Conan Doyle imagined him.
Exactly. And this idea of purely intentional objects has some pretty wild implications, especially when we start looking at art and how it works on us.
This is getting good. It sounds like these purely intentional objects might just hold the key to understanding how art impacts us, maybe even how it shapes how we see the world.
You're on the right track. And that's exactly where we're heading next. And that's where Ingarden really took this idea and ran with it, especially when it came to thinking about art. His most famous book, The Literary Work of Art.
Oh yeah, I've heard of that one.
Yeah, that's the one where he really dives deep into all of this.
It's funny you mention that because sometimes when I'm reading a really good book, I swear the world the author created feels more real than like the actual world outside my window.
That's a great example of these purely intentional objects at work. Ingarden would say that the characters you meet in a book, the places you picture in your mind, those are all purely intentional objects. They come to life first in the author's mind and then again in yours as you read.
So it's like a collaboration almost. The author sets the stage, but it's up to the reader to really bring it all to life in their imagination.
That's the idea. And to understand how that happens, Ingarden actually broke down a literary work into 4 distinct layers.
4 layers. Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's peel back those layers and see what's inside.
All right, so the first layer is all about the sounds and rhythms of the words themselves. Think about the sounds the words make even before you really understand what they mean, like the way a poem might use alliteration or how certain words just sound harsher or softer than others.
Right, right. It's like the pure music of the language, how the words sound on their own.
Exactly. And then you've got the second layer, which is where meaning comes into play. This is all about the words themselves, how they connect to form sentences and paragraphs, and ultimately the whole story.
Okay, so we've got the sound of the words and then the meaning of the words. What comes next?
Layer number 3 is where things get interesting. Ingarden calls these the schematized aspects, and this is where the words start to create pictures in your mind. Like, the author might not describe everything in perfect detail, but they give you enough clues to start filling in the blanks yourself.
So it's kind of like a blueprint. The author provides the basic outline, but it's up to each reader to build their own mental picture of what's happening.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And because everyone brings their own experiences and imagination to the table, the picture one person creates might be a little different from someone else's, even if they're reading the same book.
Which would explain why people can have such different interpretations of the same story. They're each sort of building their own unique version of it in their minds. Okay, on to the final layer. What's at the top of this literary cake?
This is where we get to the heart of it all, the represented objects. This layer includes the characters, the events, the whole world the author has created.
So this is where Sherlock Holmes finally steps onto the scene, right?
Yeah,
Pacing around Baker Street, solving those impossible mysteries.
you got it. And the key point Ingarden makes is that each of these 4 layers contributes something unique to the overall experience of the work. He even compares it to music, like you've got all these different instruments playing their own parts, but when they come together, it creates this beautiful symphony.
I love that analogy. It really shows how much more a book is than just words on a page. It's this whole world that comes to life in your mind. But Ingarden didn't just stop with literature, did he? He was also fascinated by architecture.
You're right, he was. He wanted to see how all these ideas about purely intentional objects and the different modes of being could be applied to other art forms.
I can see where he's going with that. Like, take a building like the Eiffel Tower. Is it just a bunch of metal beams, or is it something more than that?
I think Ingarden would say it's definitely more than just metal. He said even objects that seem completely physical, like buildings, still have that purely intentional aspect to them. They carry meaning based on who created them, what purpose they serve, and how we experience them.
So the Eiffel Tower isn't just steel. It's also a symbol of Paris, of engineering, maybe even of romance, right? It's all those extra layers of meaning that turn it from a structure into a landmark.
Exactly. And that connects really well with another philosopher we've talked about, Husserl, and his idea of the life world.
The life world. Remind me what that is again?
Right. So the life world is the world as we actually experience it, not just the objective physical reality, but also all the meanings and values that we project onto it.
So it's this constant back and forth between the world out there and the world we create in our minds.
That's it. And Ingarden would say that art plays a huge role in helping us understand this interplay, how we're always actively shaping the reality we experience.
This is really making me rethink how I see everything around me. But before we go too far, can we circle back to Ingarden's idea of the aesthetic object for a second? I'm still not quite clear on that.
Sure, of course. Remember how we were talking about those places of indeterminacy in a work of art?
Like those blank spaces in a coloring book that you get to fill in yourself.
That's a great way to think about it. When you encounter a work of art, whether it's a book, a painting, or a building, you fill in those gaps with your own interpretations, creating your own unique experience. And that's what Ingarden called concretization.
So the aesthetic object isn't the actual physical book or painting, but the individual experience that happens in the reader or viewer's mind.
You got it. And that helps us understand why different people can have such completely different reactions to the same piece of art. They're each concretizing it in their own way, bringing their own personal baggage to the experience.
That makes so much sense. It's like each of us is creating our own little masterpiece in our minds based on the materials the artist gave us.
Exactly. And Ingarden believed that this act of concretization is a crucial part of what makes art so powerful. It's not just about passively looking at something, but actively engaging with it and participating in creating its meaning.
This is really blowing my mind. We're all artists in a way, constantly shaping and reshaping our own realities as we move through the world.
And you know what? That's actually a great segue into one of the most important implications of Ingarden's work. It's not just in art where we co-create reality, but in our everyday lives too.
So it's not just artists who are creating, it's all of us, all the
Yeah.
time.
That's exactly what Ingarden was getting at. Yeah.
Yeah.
Every time you interpret a work of art, interact with an object, even just have a thought or feeling, you're adding to this ongoing creation of your reality.
Wow, that is a powerful thought. It really makes you realize how much power we have to shape the world around us. They're kind of inspiring and a little bit scary all at the same time.
It really is, isn't it? And that's what's so cool about Ingarden's philosophy. It really pushes you to think deeply about what reality even is, and the power of our minds, and how art can show us so much about what it means to be human.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, starting with a philosopher a lot of folks might not even know, and ending up with, well, questioning the very nature of reality itself.
And that's what makes these deep dives so great, right? You never know where they'll take you.
My head is definitely spinning with all these new ideas. It's pretty amazing how a philosopher who, wasn't even alive anymore can still be so relevant to our world today.
His work is especially relevant now, with all this stuff about virtual reality and social media, where the lines between what's real and what's not are getting, well, kind of blurry.
It's like Ingarden saw this coming. Like, he gave us this whole framework for understanding how we create meaning, not just in art, but in, like, every part of our lives.
He was ahead of his time for sure. He really wanted us to be active in creating our realities, to think about the choices we make, and to appreciate how complex the world really is.
So what does all of this mean for you, dear listener? How does Ingarden's philosophy fit into your own experiences? How are you co-creating your reality? We'll leave you with those questions to ponder.
And if this deep dive has you wanting more, I definitely recommend checking out some of Ingarden's work. This was just a taste, just a little appetizer to get you started.
Until next time, keep those minds curious, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.